First of all, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed your book. It's a character-driven nonfiction. It's a great read if you haven't read it. It's the stories of people, and I think that really shows us what they went through. We get their personal stories, which makes these statistics come alive. And I found it a really compelling read. It was really, really interesting, and especially because I was there for part of it. Just for a year, but it's so interesting to read this now and think back. We knew it was tough for women to reach the highest levels of science, or anything for that matter at that time. There was a lot of talk about glass ceilings. But when you start to read the personal stories of Nancy Hopkins and other women, what sort of the toll it took on them to constantly do this battle, and you realize how important it is to be in a supportive environment to be really good at anything, right? Whether it's science or something else. And little did I know that Nancy Hopkins, this is the iconic image in your book, was crawling around on the floor with a tape measure at night, letting herself into labs to test to see whether women had less lab space than men. And because the chairman of her department had told her that it was the same. It turned out that even a junior faculty member had twice as much space as she did. So that is such a compelling image. So I think what I wanted to ask you first is, how did you find this story? And a character like Nancy Hopkins, who just is fascinating.
She is a great character. And one of the things, this book is really, what the women talked about was unconscious bias. And when I first did this story in 1999 as a reporter for the Boston Globe, unconscious bias was really a new concept. And the first big paper on unconscious bias was written in 1995. When I came back to this story to write it as a book, I started in 2019, and by that point, unconscious bias had become so familiar to people that I think we become numb to it, and people think, oh, I've been cured of that, I took the workplace training on that, I don't need to think about that, it doesn't really exist, whatever. And so I really did want to tell Nancy's story intimately, and so that people could really feel what it feels like to be discriminated against. Because I think, in particular for women, there's a sense that, oh no, we've moved far enough for women. We've solved the problem of discrimination against women. It doesn't really exist. And when it really is in these sort of small ways that it does exist. That these are the hurdles women are up against. It's in their day-to-day lives. So it was important to me to have that. But I came to this story in 1999. I was a reporter for the Boston Globe. I had just started covering higher education. My father was a physicist, and he had talked to me about the relatively few women in physics, and he would give talks to rooms, and he would say, "Okay, guys," and then he would say, "Oh no, my daughter who's in college now, she would tell me I can't say guys," and then he would look around in the room, and it would be indeed all guys. So my dad had told, when I took over the higher ed beat, he said, you should look up this woman, Millie Dresselhaus, and the work, she's a physicist at MIT, you should look up the work that she's doing to get more women into science. And I was like, yeah, Dad, whatever, that's a terrible idea. So I completely ignored him. But 6 months later, I got a tip from someone in the newsroom, and to this day, I can't remember who it was, that there was something going on with women and discrimination at MIT. And because my father had planted the seed, I was like, okay, I'll call on that. And I called, and I was given the name of this woman, Nancy Hopkins, and I called her. And the first thing that I noticed, which is what everyone notices about Nancy, is she has a slight British accent. She's actually not English, but it's her remnant of her grandmother. But that sort of dogs her throughout the story. And she said, well, yes, in fact, MIT was going to admit that it discriminated against women. And again, I'd like to say in journalism, that's what we call a dog bites man story. A man bites dog story, not man bites dog story. It was unusual, right, in 1999 that a university would actually university president would say, yes, we did this. And it hadn't been prompted by a lawsuit. Nancy told me that, in fact, it had been prompted by a group of women who had come together and they'd gathered all this data and made their case. So that was the second element of the story for me, which was like, wow, these women really leaned into their science. And it struck me as a very MIT thing to do. Long before we talked about computer hackers, MIT had these what are called hacks. And a hack at MIT is you take a police car, you dismantle it, and you reassemble it on the top of the Great Dome, or you plant a balloon in the middle of the Harvard-Yale game to disrupt it. And it struck me that these women had kind of hacked their own institution by showing them the data and making the case so powerfully. And then the third thing was that they talked about unconscious bias. And to me, that was, again, it was a fresh idea at the time, and this story was just so fascinating. But so I went and I interviewed Nancy, and I said, well, how did you start doing this? And she said, well, I had moved into studying zebrafish, and I needed more space for my fish tanks, and I couldn't get more space, even though the men had more space than I did. And I said, well, how did you know? And she said, well, I measured. I said, you measured? And she said, yes. with a tape measure? And I was like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Now here's this woman, she was in her early 50s at the time, incredibly distinguished, going around, she measured every square inch of the building, every lab space, every office space, and as Anne mentioned, she was a fully tenured faculty member at the time. Even men without tenure had more space. One man had twice as much space as Nancy did. So it was really this astonishing story. I thought it was a great story. I'm always on the lookout for great stories, right? What journalist isn't? But I didn't anticipate how this story would, as we say now, go viral. So the story runs on a Sunday. Monday morning, the dean of science shows up to his office. There's a news crew from CBS Evening News outside his door. Nancy walks into her office. The phone is ringing. The phone, I couldn't get through. This is in the days of busy signals. I could not get through to her for a week. I finally sent her an email saying, just wanted to follow up. But she picks up her phone and it's Radio Australia. Everyone wanted to talk to her. And then the New York Times put it on their front page on Tuesday. And suddenly the women in this story were mobbed with emails from women across the country and really across the world saying, this is my story. Yeah. So I thought it was I was like the daughter of a scientist who had found this quirky thing that was of interest to only her. And it really took off in ways that I didn't anticipate.
Well, and one thing that is so interesting is Nancy, you'll read in the story, starts out thinking, her mentor was Jim Watson, by the way, which is really interesting that he was such a good mentor to so many women, that more than one, and consistently a good mentor. But she starts out thinking that her science is going to be enough. Yeah. That if she's really, really good at her science, which she was, that would be enough and she would do really, really well. And it takes her forever to realize that this is discrimination, right? And you document that very well. You document people behaving very badly. Can you not hear? Oh, sorry. You document people behaving very badly as well. And you name names. I want to name some of them. David Baltimore, Phil Sharp, Eric Lander, who was just our presidential advisor. When you think of this, are there some anecdotes that you think are really iconic other than the tape measure for her and some of the other women? What would you sort of say is a good example of the kind of, these were faculty women at MIT. This is not even grad students or people that are marginal. Just to even be on the faculty at that point, there weren't even very many of them, something like less than 20.
Yeah, so when I did this story in 1999, the School of Science at MIT had 197 men with tenure, 15 women. 1999, not 59, 99. But yeah, so it was one of the most challenging things about this, and you and I talked before about how I gathered information and the archival material. But the hardest thing for me in terms of that, because I didn't, you can't be inside someone's mind at the time, was figuring out how this arc of Nancy's consciousness, she starts out not at all a feminist. The book opens in 1963, and Nancy is a junior at Radcliffe. She's 19 years old, and she's casting about for what to do with her life, because she has a boyfriend she's pretty sure she's going to marry. And she thinks, okay, I'm going to get married. I have to have the kids. I have to have the dog, the house in the suburbs, whole thing. I'm going to have to, go off and work with the kids. But I want to do something amazing in the next 10 years before I have to have kids. And she discovers this amazing thing in this lecture by James Watson, and it's the study of DNA. And she's not a particularly bold person, but she goes to Watson's lab and says, can I work for you? He anoints her a scientist. He says, you've got a one-track mind. You're like me. I mean, it's really pretty heady stuff. But it really, so Nancy will say, this is 1963. She gets hired at MIT in 1973. It's the dawn of affirmative action. And Nancy will say that it took her 20 years to become a feminist. So there are a couple of things. So 1973, she gets hired. Just before that, Watson has come out. Just because you mentioned Watson, and I love the scene in the book. Watson publishes The Double Helix, which is the account of how he and Francis Crick decoded the structure of DNA in 1968. And the book was a huge international bestseller, but it did cause some controversy. It ruptured some friendships, including between Watson and Crick. Nancy reads the book in manuscript form, and I love this just for this crowd. I'll tell you, they're on their way to Woods Hole, and they're rumbling down Route 3 and Watson's Spider, and the convertible. And Nancy's got these manuscript pages flying all over, and it's really amazing stuff. And she reads about a woman named Rosalind Franklin, and who now we know of, the woman who James Watson took the photograph from. And Watson says, well, the feminists are going to go crazy over my book. And Nancy thinks, what is wrong with these feminists? This is a great story. And why can't they see this? She doesn't know who Rosalind Franklin is. So one of the things that happens is, so she gets this job at MIT in 1973. And as you say, she doesn't think like, oh gosh, I'm an affirmative action baby, how's this going to work out? She thinks it doesn't matter because science is a meritocracy. It's all about your work. If I work hard enough, anything is possible to me. Because the hurdle for women, in her mind, is getting the job, and I've already got the job. So that's 1973. Around 1980, she reads a biography of Rosalind Franklin, and she's having some issues. In the early 70s, she's hired to the Center for Cancer Research at MIT, which is run by David Baltimore, who's just discovered retroviruses. And David Baltimore runs the center is really built around David Baltimore, and he's got this open plan so that everyone's lab benches are all in the middle, and so everyone's kind of working together, and the idea is that you're going to share ideas, and there'll be this great creative ferment. But what it means for Nancy, because she's the only woman there, is that everyone thinks that what Nancy has is theirs for the taking. So first of all, people think that Nancy, as the only woman, must be the secretary. So the UPS guy gives her the packages to sign for. The postdocs think she's a postdoc and take the cells that she has, spent weeks cultivating. So that's a bit of a problem. But Nancy thinks, oh, it's because David Baltimore doesn't like me. She thinks, but that's not sexism, it's just personality. She thinks it's because it's this wide open space, like that's a problem. Anyway, so it's sort of this gradual consciousness, but she does everything to tell herself this isn't sexism, this isn't discrimination. In the 1980s, early 1980s, she's reading this book about Rosalind Franklin, and she recognizes in the difficulties that Rosalind Franklin had, her own difficulties. But she still thinks...
say that Rosalind Franklin found the double helix shape, right? The photograph.
She did, yes. I mean, Rosalind Franklin
didn't recognize it.
She didn't recognize it, right?
Right.
So
and that's what Jim Watson took a photo of.
Yeah. So
which helped them win the Nobel Prize with Francis Crick.
Yeah.
They realized that DNA has this double helical shape.
Yeah.
Right.
So she's reading this book about Rosalind Franklin and thinking about her own difficulties, but she still thinks, well, it's just that it's cancer research is so competitive. And I need to get away from these sharp-elbowed people. So she thinks, okay, I'm going to go into a different area. First she thinks it's just that the fifth floor in the cancer center is so competitive. And this is where Phil Sharp, another Nobel Prize winner, Phil Sharp is working. Bob Weinberg, who discovers the first human oncogene, is working there. David Baltimore is working there. Nancy thinks, I just have to get away from the fifth floor. So she moves her lab to the third floor. Then she discovers that there's a guy named Bill Hazeltine who had been in Baltimore's lab, is now at Harvard Medical School. Nancy has discovered this P30, which is a protein, and this is how she's gotten tenure. Bill Hazeltine is going around the country giving speeches saying that he, in fact, discovered P30. So someone comes to her and says, I'm really sorry that Bill Hazeltine is taking credit for your work. So she's sort of astonished by that. That makes her think that the problem is not the fifth floor, the problem is cancer. So she decides, okay, I'm going to go into something else. I'm going to go into, and she ends up moving to the study of zebrafish and developmental biology. And that field is led by a woman, and she thinks, okay, what's it going to be like in a field led by women? Maybe there won't be so much discrimination. And that's when she goes into zebrafish and she needs more lab space and discovers she can't get space. So that's one problem. And just as she's sort of solved the space problem, and she's beginning to think, in solving the space problem, she realizes that she's also underpaid. So she's beginning to see that this might be discrimination, but she still thinks that for it to be sexual harassment, there has to be sex. So she's not willing to say it's sexual harassment yet or sexual discrimination. And she doesn't even really think of the concept of sexual discrimination. She's only thinking of harassment. And then after that, she is tasked by MIT to teach this very important course. It's the first time that MIT is going to make biology a required course for undergraduates. And they asked Nancy to develop the course. And again, Nancy thinks like, I got this. I've developed this very successful course in teaching biology to non-biology students. And they say, well, who do you want to teach it with? And she said, it doesn't really matter to me. So they say, okay, we're going to have you teach it with this guy, Eric Lander. So they teach together for 3 years. And Nancy really does the yo woman's work of, ordering the textbooks and finding the right space. And she and Lander teach together for 3 years. And then they get fantastic ratings. The course has fantastic ratings. The dean of science is thrilled. The department chair is thrilled. And just before they're starting to teach it for the fourth year, the department head calls her in and says, what do you want to teach next year? And she says, the bio class, of course. And he says, no, Eric wants to teach that with Harvey. And Nancy, sputters and doesn't really know what to do. And that's when she realized, she looks at the course evaluations and she sees that her evaluations are really good. And it's not that she's continuing to blame herself, which is, I think, something that a lot of women do. And she looks for the problem within herself. And it is seeing these evaluations and seeing this number where it's like, no, I'm actually getting some of the highest evaluations in this department. This isn't about me. This is about the system. And that's really when but what she does is, she fights, and she tries to solve her problem within MIT the way she solved the space problem. She goes to the dean, she goes to the provost. She can't fix the problem. They sort of stall her, and ultimately Eric ends up teaching the class with Harvey Lodish. So Nancy thinks, okay, I have one thing I can do, one thing left. I'm going to write a letter to the president of the university because this guy seems like he's sort of progressive, and I'm going to tell him there's discrimination here, and surely he will, set about fixing it. And she writes this letter, and she shows it to a former boyfriend who's about 20 years older, and he says to her, oh my God, you cannot send this letter because the president doesn't know you, and he'll think you're just not that good a scientist, and it's a personality conflict, whatever. So Nancy thinks, oh God, I better. So she shows it to a woman who she doesn't know very well, but respects greatly, Mary Lou Pardue, who's the first woman at the School of Science, first woman at MIT to be elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And they go out to lunch, and they sit over this small table, and Nancy watches as Mary Lou reads this letter, and she's thinking, oh my God, Mary Lou is going to tell me that I'm not a good scientist, this is my fault, and she's going to, find a nice way to explain this to me. And finally, Mary Lou looks up and says, I'd like to sign this letter, and I think we should go see the president, because I've long thought that there's been a problem for women in this department, especially senior women, and I think we should do something about it. And Nancy she cannot believe there is someone else who's experiencing what she is experiencing. And so then she sort of, she's astonished, and then she says, do you think there might be more? And so they think, oh God, well, let's talk to every woman at MIT. But surely there are so many women at MIT, we can't possibly talk to all of them. Let's just start with the School of Science, which is one of 5 schools. So they go back to a third friend in the biology department, and they take down the course catalog to see, to write a list of all the women they're going to go talk to. And that's when they realize that there are only 15 women. And they just think like, oh my God. So they pull 2 women in from engineering who are cross-appointed to the School of Science. And those women get together and share experiences. And they go to the dean, and the dean does begin to fix the problem. But the men are really freaked out by the whole thing, and the men are worried. The men feel attacked.
The department chairs.
The department chairs in particular
oppose this, exactly.
Yeah.
And one thing you should also say is when Eric Lander wanted to teach the course, it's because he and the other guy had gotten a contract to do a textbook. They were going to make a lot of money from it.
As they tell her that we're going to make millions.
And she'd done all the work preparing the course, right? Initially, I think that was it. She'd done a lot of the work.
She'd done the work preparing the course, and she had taught a previous. So this was as I said.
So they were going to make a lot of money. They wanted her off. They wanted it for themselves. So this was commercial reason, and the department chair backed them up.
Yeah.
Moved her off it so
because
they could do
at the time, Eric Lander, who was very instrumental in the Human Genome Project, had just gotten this enormous grant for the for the Whitehead Institute.
Right.
He went on to co-found the Broad, or to found the Broad. If you're a department head, you need your course covered, and you want to be nice to the guy who's getting a lot of money for your department.
Yeah.
So
he went on to be science advisor, but then left under charges of bullying recently. So maybe this foreshadowed that a bit. It's very interesting. So one thing about your reporting, how do you have all these stories and anecdotes? How did you get all this information that tells these stories and these conversations with quotes? How did you get all that? What are your...
Well, one of the things I'll say about, again, I think I said this to you when we spoke earlier, the best compliment that I got on this was from Nancy, and then a young woman, Sangeet Debasha, who considers Nancy a mentor, who's now an institute professor at MIT. And they both said, I didn't understand my own life until I read your book. And what they meant was that really you have to understand this in the context, in the culture of the time. So the early book, as I said, starts at Harvard. And the great thing about Harvard is it's so self-important that it keeps track of everything. So there are amazing archives at Harvard, and you can just go back and you read these, you read the reports of the Radcliffe president, and you really had a sense of you get a sense of the time, and you get the Radcliffe yearbooks. Nancy, I should say this in case anyone doesn't know this about Nancy. She is the one who stood up to Larry Summers, walked out on Larry Summers when he said in a speech in 2005, and again, I will say in 2005, not that long ago, that the reason there were so few women at the highest levels of math and science is that they lacked the intrinsic aptitude to do high-level math. which is not true and had been disproved by study after study after study. So Nancy became somewhat infamous after this, and a publisher came to her and said, a book agent came to her and said, "Would you like to write a memoir?" So Nancy had taken a stab at that. So I had some of her own writings about her childhood, and then I was able to interview her. And then I had, MIT also has very intricate, record keeping, and so there was a lot of that. Toward the end, Watson, who, as Anne mentioned, was a mentor to Nancy. When all of this stuff started happening with the space, Watson said to her, "You need to write down everything. Everything that happens, you write it down," which was fantastic for me because there's this incredible record of every time she has a conversation with someone, it's back and forth.
And then they mailed it. She would mail it to herself so it would be post-dated.
But what's so interesting is the number of women. So Mary Lou Pardue had this situation. The book starts with Mary Lou's story as well. Mary Lou had a situation when she first got to MIT in the 70s where there was a man who was taking credit for her work. And so she would write herself letters and send them, and so she would remember, and there would be a postmark on it. She then helps a graduate student in the late 80s, and the graduate student has done the same thing. And then Nancy now in the 90s has to do the same thing. At some point you wonder, why are we still in this stage where women are having to document everything that happens to them to prove discrimination? So Nancy kept these journals, and then also this is now the early to mid 90s, so there were emails, and so all the emails back and forth between Nancy and all of her fights with people over space, and
she shared those with you.
Yeah. So one of the impetus for returning to this book, one of the things was that Nancy was wondering what to do with she has this shelf full of notebooks with every email and the floor plans that are color coded of who has how much space, and she was wondering what to do with them, and so that's how we talked about a book. Yeah.
Because that was a big question for me. Why now? I mean, we have women. One of your characters is Marcia McNutt, who was one of the MIT women who signed the letter. She was the editor of science. She's head of the Academy of Sciences now. Our head of NIH is a woman. So we've made a lot of progress, a lot of strides. So why do this book now? What's the importance of this now?
Right. So Nancy did have, as I said, she was wondering what to do with her papers. And this was in it was January. The first conversation we had about it was January 5th, 2018. And if you remember, we were coming out of the surge of Me Too, right? Me Too is October of 2017. And so I was young enough when I wrote the story in 1999 that these women really did stick with me, and I really was impressed by their, for lack of better word, just their ingenuity and how they had, gone about this in such a creative way. I mean, again, measuring, pulling the data, really leaning into your science, making your case so effectively. So as a young woman sort of advancing in my career, I always thought about them and their example, and every time there would be sort of a hiccup or some story about women and discrimination, I would think of their example. So I was watching the Me Too movement and thinking about them and thinking to myself, okay, this is great, and I'm glad that we are talking about this, but it struck me that the Me Too movement and the egregious sexual assault that we were sexual harassment, sexual assault that we were talking about was a part of the problem, but didn't explain the larger problem, and the larger problem that women are still experiencing. And that is what the women at MIT had talked about, which was this, as they say, subtle and gradual and increasing marginalization over the course, particularly for professional women, over the course of your career. And as I said, so I thought that this story could be instructive. At this point, people had largely forgotten about the MIT story. I think if they knew Nancy, they knew her as the woman who'd stood up to Larry Summers. And so it struck me that their story could be instructive to this new generation. And also, again, these women had articulated unconscious bias before anyone was talking about it. And as I said at the start, by 2018, we were talking about it so much that people were numb to it. So I thought, okay, it's important to continue to talk about this. We have not solved this problem. And this book can help people understand how it works through this very personal story.
You talk a little bit about the Millie Dresselhaus effect. A few women are really successful, and everybody points to those few women to say, oh, women are fine. So the other women feel like, well, what's wrong with me that I can't have 4 kids and be, chair of the department, right?
It's one of the reasons I call the book The Exceptions, because these women were exceptional in their science, right? They were exceptional to be able to get jobs at the time they got jobs. But they also when they were faced with problems, what they all did, same thing. They all explained it away as an exceptional situation. Well, it's a one-off. It's not a pattern of discrimination. It's a one-off. It's happening because of me, or it's happening because of the circumstance. But the other way, in that this book is about the exceptions, is the role that these really token women, and they would call themselves that, the role that they play, right?
Yeah.
So Millie Dresselhaus is a physicist at MIT. She's an early pioneer in semiconductors. They call her the queen of carbon. She had 4 kids. The legend was that she had taken off a total of 5 days because the kids had the good grace to be born on a weekend. One of them came on a snow day, one of them came on a day off. So Millie had never taken it. But as a result, the men at MIT would be like, first of all, they'd be like, well, we have women, we have Millie, right? And we have Sheila Widnall, who went on to be Secretary of the Air Force. We had Sheila and Millie. It was like Sheila, Millie, Sheila, Millie. For the other women who didn't have children because they wouldn't have been able to handle it, it was like, well, what are you complaining about? Millie can get it done. You know, one of the women, Penny Chisholm, who's amazing, National Medal of Science winner, discovered Prochlorococcus, which is the most abundant photosynthetic organism in the ocean, really important to understanding climate change. Penny was a marine biologist, and she would go in for her reviews, and they would say, well, Millie, and she was like, Millie is a physicist and an electrical engineer. Like, why are you comparing me to Millie? And it was because they were both women, and I think that happens today.
So we have 10 minutes left for questions. Okay, perfect, because I have 2 more questions. That's great that I want to ask. So one of those questions is you name names. You name names of some of these men. How did some of these men respond? And let's ask this tough question. Is it fair to judge them by today's standards when we're looking at bad behavior in the 80s, right? When some of these guys were totally self-absorbed, but what they did was really harmful. Extremely harmful, and in a very competitive science, they probably treated other men badly too, but especially women. How did they respond? What's your response to that kind of comment?
So different ways. But what was really striking was how few of them denied this. How few of them denied what had happened. So David Baltimore, Nancy does get into this conflict with David Baltimore, where he tries to tinker with her tenure case. So Nancy's put up for tenure with 2 other men at the same time. So the department is nominating 3 people. Nancy's letters are the best. So the nominating committee recommends her number 1, someone else number 2, and someone else number 3. Baltimore goes in and changes the name. So his protege is number 1, Nancy's number 2. So when I went to Baltimore, he just said, well, I just thought that Bob's work was better. And again, like, we're talking about a margin of difference. The second person was Bob Weinberg, who goes on to discover the human oncogene. Nobody's going to deny that Bob Weinberg should have gotten tenure at MIT, but he hadn't done the same work that Nancy had at that stage. Right. So Nancy really did deserve to be nominated first. But he just, David just thought that she was better. Bill Hazeltine, who's the one who was going around giving speeches, taking credit for her work, I really expected a fight from him. I expected, no, that didn't happen. He was like, no, I was. He said, I had no idea Nancy was doing this because she wasn't in the circle of scientists that I talked to about my work. And again, that strikes me as part of the problem, right? It's this culture of who are you talking to? Who's included? Who's marginalized? Who's on the panel? Who's now on the grant? I mean, there are just so many subtle ways in which this happens. But the only person who has continued, including in an email yesterday, to argue about this is Eric Lander. And he argues, yes, we were going to make millions by writing this textbook, but we never wrote a textbook. And it's like, well, yes, but you really tried hard to write that textbook. And it was only when you were beaten down after 2 attempts that you didn't write the textbook.
Right, and to leave Nancy out.
Yeah.
Frank Solomon as well. He also interfered with tenure cases. And it was a long line of them.
But to your second question, that we could have a whole festival on this question, right? Like, do we judge the art? Art is separate from the art, science is separate from the science. I think we don't necessarily even have to, I'm going to punt, how about that? We don't necessarily even have to answer that question, but we have to think about what's happening in our own time and think 20 years from now, are we going to think, why are we putting up with this, right? I don't think we're not going to deny all of their experiments.
No, we need to document it. Yeah. And I think you go on to say that this is a story about women in science. It's not just about women in science, it's how women are treated or mistreated in many fields. And all these years later, we still don't take women as seriously as intellectuals. And I think by looking at, I'll answer your question. For me, by looking at the history, I think we hopefully will learn from it, right? And see the roots of it and how some of that is still influencing what we do today. I think it's very important to document this and get the true story of what people have overcome to get where we are.
Yeah, I think it's worth repeating the anecdote that I mentioned yesterday. I hope I'm not repeating for anyone. But in 1980, which is the year that the percentage of women on U.S. College campuses overtakes the percentage of men. So now it's now 60% women on American college campuses for undergraduates. Definitely not for faculty. For faculty, it's about in the high 30s. But that year, a male professor comes to Nancy and asks if she'd like to co-teach this introductory course on genetics. Nancy says, great, love this, I'm good at genetics, a good lecturer, I'm very confident. And this guy says, great. He goes to the department chair. The department chair says, nope. He says, I know Nancy Hopkins is a fantastic lecturer, but undergraduates will not accept information from a woman at the front of a lecture hall. And Nancy, rather than thinking, she's at this stage in her feminist development, rather than thinking like, that's outrageous, I should protest, I should go to whatever the dean of science, she thinks, thank God he spared me embarrassment and bad student evaluations. But I think actually we are still at a stage where we don't trust women to deliver serious information as much. We just don't trust them as intellectuals as much as we trust men. And that is true for men and for women. So I think the challenge for all of us is in our own minds to think like, who are we thinking of as the expert? Who are we thinking of as the genius? And when you listen to a man, are you a man or a woman? Would you take the information more seriously if it were delivered by a man? I think it's a fascinating question.
Lessons learned, and then we'll open it up to questions. What did these women learn? I mean, I would say off the bat to work together, to get data, but there's also a lot there about the early pioneers had to have supportive husbands, which was really a crapshoot, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a tough one. So what kind of things do you feel like we learned from these stories? Or what
supportive husbands, amazing childcare. I think so. Yeah, Millie Dresselhaus had amazing childcare, which, by the way, was she got a babysitter from the Harvard Babysitter Service, which was women who were spouses of men studying at Harvard who had to earn a living somehow, so they became babysitters for Harvard and MIT faculty. So lessons learned, I would say this is definitely a story about the importance of women coming together. What these women will say over and over, and I've done a bunch of panels and discussions with them, is none of them, this story wouldn't have happened unless they had come together. None of them would have done this without Nancy, and Nancy would not have done this without them. Having those women behind her allowed her to become the face of this movement. So that was critical. I do think, and this is a somewhat more controversial one, especially with young women I talk to, this is actually a story about how you can affect change within the system. The conditions have to be right. The most important condition is really the leadership. It was Chuck Vest, who sadly died too young, the president of MIT, who really had the foresight to say, he didn't even consult, MIT had no general counsel at the time. He didn't consult any lawyer. He was just like, this is the right thing to do, and we are going to acknowledge this, let the cards fall where they may. And of course, other university presidents looked at him and said, like, only MIT could get away with admitting discrimination and making it look like a good thing. But he really did do the right thing by stepping up and taking responsibility.
So I think now we should open this up to questions. There are 2 microphones, and I'd love to get questions from the audience. You've got one right there. Yeah,
I do. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. I look forward to the book. I worked for a large international oil company for many, many years.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, there was only one woman whose name came up over 40 years. That was the only name that was mentioned as an executive at this oil company. Now, in the past few years, it's only women being promoted to those positions. So my question is, have we gone too far? Is it just, or is it another wrong?
Yeah. So I've spent a long time covering education, and one question in K through 12 education is the idea of representation in the classroom. So is it important for black students to have a black teacher at the front of the classroom? Is it important for young boys to have a male? Is it, women have a... And the research is, at least when I was covering it, was a little uncertain, unclear, not definitive. Doing this book has made me a real believer in the importance of numbers, not just because, like, if you can see it, you can be it, but this idea, just reporting this book, I wrote about this for the Boston Sunday Globe magazine. I've been a reporter for 30 years. I've always thought, like, I really should quote more women as experts, right? But it's only in writing this book. So the year before I wrote this, before I started book leave for this book, I was covering women in politics. So I spent 2018 basically talking only to women, right? Women who were organizing this is post-women's marches. Women who are organizing, women who are running for offices. I go off, I write this book, I start talking to women. I come back, I'm now covering abortion for the New York Times. So the result of this is that I've spent the last 5 years pretty much talking to women as almost exclusively as sources, to the point that I do wonder, have I gone too far? But the way it has changed my own work, my own approach to my work, my own confidence level, makes me think selfishly, like that it took this long, but numbers really do matter. It does matter for you to see, it's not just if you can see it, you can be it. It's understanding the diversity of what women can do, that it is no longer the exception for women to be at the front of a classroom. It's no longer the exception for women to be on the front page. We have to see examples of this over and over and over. So will we reach a stage where we go too far? Maybe. Do I think we're there now? No, I really don't.
Well, also, science is a social process, and as are many things, and who gets access to the data, the funding, the field sites, the best students, it's a social process. It's not enough. So this requires a critical mass of people, right? You need your colleagues to help you make that happen. But also, just
quickly to say, just one more thing, we trust the line now in politics, right? We trust women to be legislators. We still don't trust them to be the executives, and I think that's the stage that we need to get to. We still don't trust them to put them in charge. Yeah.
Your point about the data, my daughter is a very successful, tenured professor of neuroscience at an important university. She has read your book, and it's fabulous. Thank you for being here and writing it. She wanted to have a book club, actually, at her university, but they got scared because one of the administrators was going to sort of conduct it. But what she has said, asked me to ask you the question, how to get more transparency, because of you talk about data, and they can't find out, even though the state she's in, there's certain laws where there has to be salaries. But if there's that law, it's just a range. So you have no idea where you stand. I mean, she's extremely successful professionally so far, so good, but coming against everything you have said, still, and probably going into the future as a scientist. But, also there's like no transparency within the university about
it's a private
salary,
university.
About any other issues, related to performance and their future. And I firstly feel that, like you've already said, you get distracted from your really important work as well.
Exactly, right. And again, as I said yesterday, the cost of all this, right? Like, people ask, why write about science, right? Why not write about law or finance, whatever? But we rely on science to fix our biggest problems, to fix our biggest challenges. Why? This is Bob Brown, the president of BU, who said that, it's not me, but it really is the important question. Why would we want to shut out half the population to begin with? Why? Why would you risk that? So in terms of transparency, I think, again, this is a case of the need for people to come together. I think women in particular have been afraid to share their salaries, perhaps because they don't want to be devastated by discovering that their salary is lower. So I think it is a case where if you can find a collective group to come together and pressure for transparency, I think that is certainly the first step.
We have a question over here.
Yeah.
I was wondering, as a journalist in the 90s, how do you think unconscious bias affected you? And additionally, how do you see it affecting other women today?
So it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I think in the way it plays out in journalism is that when I started in 1999, I think I was uncertain, right? Like, I was a little bit like Nancy. I was like, well, but I got the job. That's the hurdle. What you see over time, but these women had talked about how it changed over the course of their career. So I was sort of like, how's this going to affect me going on? I think where you find it in journalism is in who gets to do what stories, right? So again, it's the news beats that are the newsier beats. So who covers the Pentagon? Who covers who covers the Fed? Who covers the White House? What kinds of stories are the women doing? So I always talk about the most recent example is I think it was just before COVID. There was that country music festival in Las Vegas. And there was a horrible mass shooting. And so the lead story of the newspaper was about the lead all, what we call lead all. So it's all the facts of the day. That's written by men. The story next to it, and it wasn't on the front page, the story about the victims, the feature story, that's written by women. So that's what you see, that's what you tend to see. We have gotten better about that, but that's still where it happens. The other thing is that as journalism has opened up to women, the jobs have become less well paid. So I think women are definitely still paid less in journalism. But I think it's really, again, it is this question of, when you ask about unconscious bias, it is this question of what we trust women to do, what beats we trust them with. So for instance, I'll just give you an example. I applied to cover the Pentagon, and it was 2004. It was right after Fallujah, so the bodies hanging from the bridge, and the editor who was hiring said to me, well, you know you'd have to go to Iraq. And it's like, yes, there's a war on. I know I would have to go to Iraq. I would not be applying for this job if I did not know that. And I said this to an older woman at the time, and she said, I don't think he would have asked that of a man. And ultimately, a man did get the job. But again, even saying this now, all these 20 years later, I kind of cringe, like, oh, I must sound like I'm making excuses. I'm not a very good reporter. So where does unconscious bias affect us? It affects how we look at ourselves as well.
So I was a biochemistry major at Bowdoin back in 1990s.
Yeah.
And in 91, I received Science Magazine, and it said, it was an ad for Science Magazine would be a great gift for Father's Day. And then off the side, it said, and mothers too. And so I was just enough of a daughter of a feminist that I wrote a letter.
Good for you.
This was 91, and I got a letter back from the editor who said, no, I overreacted. And and then I got a second letter back, and it was from somebody who worked at the magazine who apologized and acknowledged that they needed to do better, written by a woman. And I carry those letters with me, and I tell my daughter and all her friends the story all the time as a Gen Xer raising Gen Z, just the things that I heard, that some people aren't made out for science, is what I was told by a physics professor. And as you went higher and higher up in your courses, you were maybe one of 2 women in 10, and that the guys all got together to study, and finally having one guy taking pity on me and saying, we've all been getting together, here are the notes, right before the final exam. And so that wasn't unconscious bias, it was like true bias, but it affects us. It affects me to this day as a 51-year-old woman. And so I think it's so important to tell these stories and to call these people out and for them to answer to that, because it has had lifelong effects on so many of us. And I see my daughter who got the science award and, wants to be a math major. I just pray that no one says that to her. And I think that's why I'm so grateful you wrote this.
Oh, thank you.
And, we are real people. We're real women who were out there doing the fight, 30 years ago. So
Good book for sons and daughters.
Yes.
Kay, you could have the last question.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, I work tangentially with engineers in technology, and it's very clear to me that the number of women engineers is much lower. And if maybe there's women running fossil fuel companies, most of the major tech companies are not run by women. This worries me that it's getting hard baked into the code. It's going to become more and more a part of our lives. And I just wonder if you see that, or you might be interested in investigating that. That future kind of could be an incredible hurdle.
I do. So I do think. The first thing you started out by saying was you work with
tangentially.
Okay.
With,
so one thing. I'll answer the question about engineers first. One of the other lessons about this is that, again, it depends on leadership. The School of Engineering at MIT, following this report, the School of Engineering did a similar report, and the Dean of Engineering was so insistent. What he did was he said, do not do that job search thing where you go out and you conduct a national search and you come back and say, we searched high and low and we couldn't find a woman, so we have to hire this guy because he's amazing and he'll go to Harvard. He said, if you don't have a woman or a person of color in your pool, don't bring me the list. Go back and look harder. That has ultimately led to MIT has there are 8 departments. Last year there were 5. 5 of those were headed by women. This year it's 4 because one of those women has gone on to be chancellor of MIT. So change, you can affect change. But the other thing I would say about so this is the work that Nancy has done more recently, which is on women in biotech. So in some ways, the biotech industry has allowed more women to go into it because the jobs can be quite flexible. But where you don't see women is in founding companies or in leading companies or even on sitting on scientific advisory boards. So Nancy and this woman, Sangeeta, and Susan Hockfield, who was the first female president of MIT, did a project called the Boston Biotech Working Group with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And they actually got a pledge from venture capital companies that they will not invest in, over 2 years, they will not invest in any company that does not have at least 25% women on their scientific advisory board. So Nancy and, right. Nancy and Sangeeta and Susan were afraid to ask for that. It was actually the VC people who came to them and offered that, and they were like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" It's unclear that this will actually happen, but they have made progress. So I think people want to do better. So I think you can have things like that. And people say, "Oh, those are quotas," but really 25%. I mean, it's not. We're not asking to take over the world.
I just worry that's Boston and Cambridge versus Silicon Valley, but that's
right. And the same problem. And they've looked at the data at Stanford, and it's very true. But I don't. But who's to say you couldn't do a similar working group for San Francisco or the Silicon Valley? I mean, I think yeah. Thank you.
Need to wrap up. Thank you so much, Kate and Anne, for the informative talk. I just want to remind everybody that Kate will be signing her book in the book signing.